Okay, this is a recap of what we've done for the past 3 days. Um, this is February 25th, 2015. Chapter 2, it starts on page 28. All right, and we'll start with the section entitled The Constitution and Democracy. The framers didn't want a pure democracy, which is one in which the people rule directly. They wanted a republic, or a government in which a system of representation operates. Members of the House of Representatives are elected directly by the people. State legislatures choose senators, electors choose president. The Electoral College, remember, is set up as each state has so many electors. Those electors vote based on the popular vote within that state. The number of electors is based on the number of representatives plus 2 senators. The next thing is that they wanted to limit the power of the popular majorities. So we saw that in the case of Marbury versus Madison, which was decided in 1803. And the implied concept of judicial review was discussed by Chief Justice Marshall, which is the power of the Supreme Court to declare an act of Congress unconstitutional. Okay. An amendment can be proposed either by a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress or by a national convention called by Congress at the request of 2/3 of the states. Then the amendment must be ratified by 3/4 of the states, either through legislatures or conventions in each state. U.S. democracy is one in which different sets of officials, chosen directly or indirectly by different groups of people, share political power. And that's brought about by the Constitution that the framers decided on. There are 2 key principles, or 2 major principles, in U.S. politics and U.S. government. The first is separation of powers. That way the powers can control each other. Internal control was very important, right, in the formation. It's shared by 3 branches of government. Okay, the U.S. political authority is divided between a national government and several state governments. Right, that would be federalism, where the political authority is divided between regions. We also see different levels in state government. Based on what you read, you should have understood that the belief was that people would seek their own advantage, that they are self-serving, and their self-interest would lead them to exploit others. In the Aristotelian view, a government should cultivate virtue among the governed. Many Americans believe this, and they believe that that would change human nature. In the Madisonian view, he was a realist, and he believed that you should work with what you have. Self-interest, which is pursued within reasonable limits, is a more practical solution than trying to change people's virtue. Self-interest could actually eventually provide unity and liberty, so that the holder of each office can, quote, resist the encroachments of others, therefore separation of powers. And in Madison's view, diversity would create strength in the group. Many founding fathers agreed with him. So how would you do that? Well, you would disperse political power among many people with limited self-interest. And the self-interest concept would work in the U.S. because of the diversification of the population and the diversification of the ideas. So what you ended up with was a double security. One level of government can serve as a check on another, state versus federal, and that's your Madisonian view. Each diverse interest in the United States will create a faction that will seek its own advantage. The factions will prevent any single government from dominating all of government, and therefore you have less of a chance of a dictatorship. Okay? So the good news was you have separation of powers, which mitigates tyranny or dictatorship. The bad news is disagreement, and could create gridlock, but the hope was that the disagreement and the differing opinions would be a good thing. Okay, so in conclusion, the 4 desirable preconditions that need to be in place in a country before democracy has a chance to survive, all right, are, okay, there needs to be an ideological commitment to democracy from the people for right and wrong, even if your candidate loses. There needs to be a positive social interactions among groups, which is respect among the races, religions, etc. And you need to notice many classes with a sizable and diverse middle class. That should create a balance between the 2 extremes and create more stability so that there isn't this desperation that people might feel. All right, and last, there needs to be a basic education system for literacy so that people have the opportunity to get themselves out of poverty. They have some political understanding, and there needs to be communication among the people in governments. There still may be problems, all right, because democracy was such a sophisticated form of government, and the people understood that dictatorship was easier, all right, it was necessary to promote these new ideas. Note that I've listed for you the anti-federalist view. All right, Madison's response in Federalist 10 and 51 to the anti-federalist view. Once again, this is just a reiteration of what I just said. Coalitions formed in large republics would be more moderate and would be much more helpful. Okay. I think you can see that right here. Okay. There were also one of the complaints of the anti-federalists was that, wait, I have to go back. One of the complaints of the anti-federalists was that there was no Bill of Rights and that there was no way to protect some general rights, all right, guaranteed rights that the people had in the Constitution. However, there were actual rights that were, and liberties that were actually in the Constitution before the Bill of Rights. They are listed here, okay? The first one, the writ of habeas corpus. A writ is a court order, and the writ of habeas corpus directs an officer who has a person in custody to bring the person before a judge and show sufficient cause for his or her detention. It may not be suspended except during invasion or rebellion, and if you remember your history, Lincoln suspended it during the Civil War. The second one is no Bill of Attainders. A Bill of Attainder is a law that declares a person without a trial to be guilty of a crime. They are not permitted to be passed by Congress or the states. Okay. The third one is no ex post facto law, a law that makes criminal an act that was legal when it was committed, that increases the penalty for a crime after it has been committed, or that changes the rules of evidence to make conviction easier. This no ex post facto law may be passed by Congress or the states. Now, sometimes you can have them occurring in civil matters, but not usually. Okay, we usually don't see that unless the law is claimed to be retroactive. Right of a trial by jury in criminal cases is guaranteed, but it's not required. It may be refused, even if there's a motion asking for it. All right, depending upon the level of emotions that surface during the crime and that would resurface again during the trial. The citizens of each state are also entitled to the privileges and immunities of the citizens of every other state because it binds us together as a union. And certainly no religious test or qualification for holding federal office is imposed. So remember, if you look back, what's the critics' argument for reducing the separation of powers? Okay. Oh, excuse me, I forgot. No law impairing the obligation of contracts can be passed by the states. The critics' argument for reducing the separation of powers. All right, one, it makes the president too weak. The system doesn't work fast enough. It's slow and gridlock can occur. And you have too many varying opinions and too much meddling by outsourced sources like special interests and pressure groups. The only alternative is a more parliamentary system. But there's really no internal control with a parliamentary system. And so it's important to note that. What are the characteristics, remember, of a democratic government? Elections. There are secret ballots. You have the one-man vote standard. Clear, legible ballots. There must be a choice, at least two parties. And there's no coercion. Consistently, all right, elections must be held consistently at specific intervals. And the person with the most votes wins, which is the plurality. It may not be 50%, all right, especially if you have more than two people running. The other feature or characteristic of a democratic government is the rule of law, all right, which is elected officials are under the same law as unelected citizens. The third one are basic citizens' rights, which are your Bill of Rights. Specifically, the First Amendment is extremely important. There are 5 clauses. All right, make sure that you know those 5 clauses in the First Amendment. All of this is, and last, that you do have due process rights. Those are also listed in the Bill of Rights. Okay, and if the Constitution needs to be reflective of reality, not necessarily the time of the founders, is another issue. Okay, remember that once you pass an amendment, all right, it negates anything regarding the subject prior to the passing of the amendment. Okay. The American Constitution is hard because we don't want pointless, bizarre ideas and an excessive number of amendments. So there have been more than 10,000 amendments proposed, but only 27 have been ratified by the states. Okay? That's federalism at its best, because then the states are checking on the proposed amendment. Right? There's the need for the Bill of Rights. Keep in mind that, all right, the Bill of Rights itself only limited the power of the national government until you saw the passage of the 14th Amendment. Okay, it's only after the passage of the 14th Amendment will the Bill of Rights protect citizens in a state court. I didn't spend much time on the Constitution and slavery, okay? I was yielding to the fact that you learned that and remembered that from U.S. history. The one unresolved issue, remember, is the Civil War. Okay? Motives of the framers. Okay, well, the framers had 3 motives. There was a political interest, an economic interest, and certainly they recognized the fact that there are human failings. Okay. Before we go forward, I want to go over the separation of powers again, and the reasons that the separation will work in spite of the criticisms of the separation of powers, that in spite of the imperfections of human nature, that it will work because of the imperfections. There's a quote in your book that says, different governments will control each other at the same time that each will be controlled by itself. And I think it's important to reiterate why the Federalist ideas prevailed. So the first criticism is obviously that we should reduce the separation of powers. And I've went through this before earlier, and I want to go through it again so that you hear it twice. All right, one, first of all, the nation often needs prompt, decisive action, and often the president needs to be capable of formulating and carrying out policies free of pressures from other branches. In the separation of powers, the president is too weak. That was one criticism. An increase in presidential authority would help voters hold the president and his party accountable for their actions. Okay? Well, in the separation of powers, the president still is held accountable by the powers of Congress. 3, critics say that the government agencies responsible for implementing the program are exposed to undue interference from legislators and special interests. Well, they are, but, with the internal controls set up and with the fact that people have the opportunity to vote, all right, and to vote out those representatives that they believe, all right, are against their wishes or against what they believe is good for the common good of the people, that's a control in and of itself. Critics all believe that the separation of powers makes the president too weak. Okay, proposals. For reducing the separation of powers, one of the proposals that was initiated by the Anti-Federalists, or at least discussed by them, allowing the president to appoint members of Congress to serve in the cabinet. That wasn't met with great approval, obviously. Secondly, allow the president to dissolve Congress and call for a special election. Third, allow Congress to require a president who has lost confidence to face the country in a special election before his scheduled term ends. That kind of reeks of parliamentary procedure. Require the president and congressional candidates to run as a team in each congressional district. That has been proposed before to eliminate the Electoral College. Have the president serve one 6-year term instead of being eligible for 2 4-year terms, which could lead without election worries. Lengthen the terms of members of the House from 2 to 4 years so the entire House would stand for re-election at the same time as the president. None of those options have been accepted, and really the only major alternative is the parliamentary system. But in the parliamentary system, remember, there's a fusion of powers. There's no formal internal checks and power, and the executive is also a member of the legislature. So you don't have the components of government that are separate. Defenders of the separation of powers claim that the parliamentary systems have done no better. All right, the congressional scrutiny of presidential proposals has improved policies more often than weakened them. All right, and you can use some examples from your current administration. And congressional interference ensures that the average citizen can fight back. Okay? There may be unintended consequences that we can't envision at this point, but it is something that's much more representative than a parliamentary system. Okay. You can look at some of the economic interests of the states from which the delegate came. Had a great effect on how they voted, all right, rather than their own monetary condition, because in the state ratification conventions, it was important based on the fact that of the money that was owed for the Revolutionary War. Likely to vote for ratification, these are the people that would be likely to vote for ratification, likely to vote not to vote for ratification. Notice that slavery is an issue. Okay. This is the section in your book on Constitution and equality. Okay. Just to reiterate, I put down here, all right, what the Federalists believed, what the Anti-Federalists believe. Okay, 2 views, all right, both for the public good. All right. Today, the debate has a new focus. Okay, all right. and I quote from your book, "The defect of the Constitution to some contemporary critics is not that the government it created is too strong, but that it's too weak. In particular, the national government is too weak to resist the pressures of special interests that reflect and perpetuate social inequality. Our understanding of the relationship between liberty and equality has changed since the founding. To Jefferson and Madison, citizens naturally differed in their talents and qualities. What you guarded against was, quote, the use of governmental power to create unnatural and undesirable inequalities. They were concerned about political power being in the hands of too few people, so they were interested in stopping the abuse of power. Right? Or if private parties, right, would acquire exclusive charters and monopolies to be pressuring the government. Okay. So what they did is that they limit the powers of branches and of regional governments, states, and they separated the powers. Today, however, people think of inequality quite differently. According to your book, quote, it's a natural social order. The marketplace and the acquisitive talents of people operating in that marketplace that leads to undesirable inequalities, especially in economic power. And the request is that the government be powerful enough to restrain these natural tendencies and produce by law, quote, a greater degree of equality than society allows when left alone. Okay? To the framers, the worst inequality was political privilege. To modern observers, right, they want to make government strong enough to reduce what they believe is the worst inequality, which today is the difference in wealth. Okay. So, all right. Bottom line, democracy today can produce bad unintended results if the government caters to special interest claims of citizens rather than long-term values. Okay? The people want the government to help, but they want the government to be less involved. All right? But the government wants to do more for people, not less. To fix this, you have a couple of options. All right? Have a constitutional amendment that would either set a limit on the amount of money the government could collect in taxes each year, or require a balanced budget. Government spending wouldn't get out of hand, all right, and don't spend more taxes than what's taken in, or both. But remember that the majority of Congress can override the limits, and that the limits wouldn't apply in wartime. This would force Congress and the President to look at the big picture, quote unquote. Others favor a line item veto. Others favor a line item veto, which gives the President authority to selectively eliminate individual items in large appropriations bills. That might reduce the amount of spending, okay? Less money equals less activity. Expansions in certain income transfer programs and tax breaks, which would leave Congress free to craft bills with few opposition for the President to veto. This could stop unwarranted spending without vetoing other provisions of a bill. However, in 1996, okay, Clinton signed a piece of legislation that would permit the President to have a line item veto, and in 1998, the U.S. Supreme Court deemed it unconstitutional. Other critics suggest narrowing the federal court's jurisdiction, I'm really not sure where that would help. Okay, all right. But then again, I'm a little biased. All right. Um, there's no precise way to measure government spending. You have to ask yourself what really is a balanced budget and what would happen during wartime, which we right now, you know, you may not want to call it wartime, but it is wartime. Courts protect citizens' rights. And really, if we have a problem with a court decision, we have to override it and propose a constitutional amendment and get it ratified. So the question is, who's right? The Constitution was written to solve problems, not to experiment with abstract philosophy. The questions you need to ask are this: how well has it worked over U.S. history? And compared to the Constitution of other democratic nations, how well has it worked? If you cap the dollars, people may not get their entitlement programs under a balanced budget. So if you cap the amount of money that is permitted to be spent, then you may eliminate Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid checks. So you really need to be cautious when you make changes, all right, in a system, okay, such as that. Okay. Women in the Constitution. Now, I mentioned this in class, and I gave you Scalia's comment. I read to you Scalia's comment, and I'm not going to put it on here. All right, mainly because I don't think I have it with me. Okay. But keep in mind that there is no mention of women. But remember Scalia's attitude. If the Constitution doesn't permit it, and it doesn't say that it's prohibited, then it's an issue left to the legislature. Now, male pronouns were often used in legal documents generically, but I'm actually a firm believer that women were left out of the Constitution because if you look at, it may not have been purposeful, but if you look at the time period, the whole situation of coverture continued. Okay, the doctrine of coverture, where all the women were under the tutelage and had few legal rights, and the only ones they did have were ones that the closest male relative gave to them. So keep that in mind when you're thinking in terms of women in the Constitution. The timeline in your book discusses it on page 43. They say, well, in one sense, yes, all right, women were left out. But in one sense, no, all right, because they're talking about persons and citizens, not necessarily men. So the question is, all right, is a woman entitled to be called a citizen for privileges and immunities within each individual state? You're going to have to look at the history, and you're going to have to look at the time period in order to answer that question. Okay? I just want to reiterate to you that you need to know the amendments, and specifically for right now, you need to know the first 10. Okay? You need to know the 5 clauses in Amendment 1. Note that Amendment 3 is obsolete now, but the Founding Fathers were still concerned with it. Amendments 4 through 8, all right, give the due process rights. Founding Fathers were very concerned with that. All right, and remember, an invasion of privacy, that phrase, nor the term privacy, ever appears in Amendments 4 through 8. It is actually implied through Amendment 9. Amendment 8 is your excessive bail. Can occur if you're a flight risk, but only if you're a flight risk. All right, what's cruel and unusual punishment? That's a question we're still answering. Amendment 9 is the catch-all amendment, that there are other rights that we have that are not specifically mentioned, like privacy. Amendment 9 was a factor in Roe versus Wade. All right. And Amendment 10 is the Reserve Power Amendment. Okay. I'll go on and give you the rest of these because you will have to know them in the future. Amendment 14, all right, federal citizens deserve same rights as state citizens. It brings the first 10 amendments to the state level. Amendments 16 through 19, 16 is income tax, 17 is direct election of senators, 18, all right, is prohibition, 19 is women's suffrage, okay, 20, it shortens the lame duck period, makes the government more efficient, all right, brings the inauguration to January instead of March. 21, okay, is the repeal of prohibition. And then 22 through 27 are the 20th century amendments, all right, for ending poll taxes, voting rights, changing the voting age, presidential disability, what happens if the presidential seat, the sitting president is assassinated or resigns, all right, and congressional pay. Done.